In 1942, the general commanding Australian forces looked at his soldiers and called them chocolate. Soldiers who melt under pressure. He looked at their hats and called them stupid. He cabled Washington, describing them as unable to match the enemy in jungle fighting. And he did all of this while those same soldiers were stopping Japan's advance across the Pacific in conditions he had never visited, with resources he had never provided. The man who called them chocolate watched from a luxury hotel in Brisbane while they bled on the Kokoda Track. The man who called their hats stupid posed with them for propaganda photographs after they won battles he had told Washington they weren't capable of winning. And when Japan surrendered in 1945, he stood on the deck of the USS Missouri as the supreme symbol of Allied victory in the Pacific. The men who had actually won that victory watched from the sidelines, as they always had. I spent months going through declassified MacArthur cables, Australian War Memorial records, and blamey correspondence to bring you this documentary. What's at stake here isn't just one general's ego. It's the question of how the most decorated American officer of the Second World War built his reputation on the backs of Australian soldiers he privately despised, and got away with it for decades. Everyone knows MacArthur as the architect of the Allied victory in the Pacific. That's the version in the American history books, the films, the biographies, the commemorations. But here's what that version leaves out. The victories MacArthur claimed as his own were won by Australians, in jungles he never entered, under conditions he never experienced, with resources he never provided. This is that story, and it starts here. On the 11th of March, 1942, a PT boat slipped through a Japanese naval blockade in the Philippines in the darkness. On board General Douglas MacArthur, his wife, his young son, his personal physician, I-4, and 13 of his staff officers, a group that would become known as the Bataan Gang. Behind him, 80,000 American and Filipino soldiers were still holding out on the Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor Island, starving, outgunned, with no prospect of rescue. MacArthur had been ordered to leave by President Roosevelt. He left. The fall of the Philippines had not been inevitable. When Japan launched its Pacific offensive in December 1941, MacArthur commanded the combined American and Filipino forces in the islands. He had been warned. He had time. And Japan's attack on Clark Air Base launched hours after Pearl Harbor destroyed much of his air force on the ground. The subsequent campaign compressed into a fighting retreat to Bataan, and then to the island fortress of Corregidor. 80,000 men holding positions that couldn't be held indefinitely. While their commander prepared to leave, Roosevelt's order gave MacArthur the cover he needed. On the 11th of March, he went. The men he left behind surrendered 6 weeks later. They died on the Bataan Death March. MacArthur was already in Australia. On the 17th of March, his aircraft landed at Bachelor Field near Darwin. 3 days later, his train stopped at a small outback town called Tarawih in South Australia. And Douglas MacArthur did what Douglas MacArthur did best. He made a speech. Standing on the platform of a railway station in the South Australian outback, he delivered the line that would define the rest of his war. "I came through, and I shall return." It was a masterpiece of personal propaganda. Simple, memorable, entirely focused on one man's narrative rather than the collective effort of the armies fighting the war he had just left. MacArthur arrived in Melbourne on the 21st of March and checked into the Menzies Hotel, one of the finest hotels in the city. Australia accepted MacArthur as Supreme Commander of the Southwest Pacific area because it had no realistic alternative. John Curtin's government was facing a Japan that had bombed Darwin, was advancing through New Guinea, and had demonstrated at Singapore that no Allied position was safe. Roosevelt wanted MacArthur in the Pacific. Australia needed American support more than it needed to choose its own commander. So on the 18th of April, MacArthur assumed command. 100,000 AIF veterans, 265,000 Australian militia, and 38,000 Americans. All of them now answering to the man who had escaped the Philippines on a PT boat in the middle of the night. The first frictions appeared almost immediately. MacArthur's staff, the baton gang he had brought from the Philippines, arrived in Australia with the attitude of men who had been through the fire and had opinions about everyone who hadn't. Australian officers who had fought in North Africa and Greece and Crete and Tobruk found themselves being assessed by American staff officers who had spent the fall of the Philippines on Corregidor watching the situation deteriorate. The cultural collision was immediate. MacArthur himself sent private cables to Washington in the early weeks describing the Australian militia as undertrained and questioning whether they could hold the line against a serious Japanese advance. In Melbourne, he pressed Curtin for total operational control. Curtin pushed back. Australia, he made clear, was not an American colony. MacArthur noted the pushback and moved on, because he had already made up his mind about the Australians. And what happened in the jungle over the next 18 months would test that assessment in ways that MacArthur had not anticipated. The Australian slouch hat had been part of the uniform since 1885. A wide-brimmed felt hat with the left side pinned up. Originally designed so cavalry soldiers could swing a saber without catching the brim. Practical in the Australian bush, effective against the tropical sun, light enough to wear for days in conditions that would destroy a conventional military helmet. And according to the American general now commanding Australian forces, embarrassing. In April 1942, MacArthur inspected Australian militia troops in Melbourne. What he saw offended his military sensibility in ways he made no effort to conceal from his staff. Slouch hats worn at angles that no military regulation had approved. Shirts open at the collar. No ties. The general appearance of men who had dressed for the Australian bush rather than for a parade ground inspection by an American four-star general. MacArthur turned to his aide. "Look at those stupid hats." It wasn't a passing comment. It was a verdict. These men didn't look like soldiers. Not the kind of soldiers MacArthur understood. Not the kind of soldiers he was accustomed to commanding. They looked, in his assessment, like bandits. General Thomas Blamey, the commander of Australian military forces, had heard versions of this complaint before. The Australians had never been a parade ground army.
They had fought in South Africa, in Gallipoli, in the trenches of France, in the North African desert, in Greece and Crete. In every one of those theaters, the slouch hat and the informal bearing that MacArthur found so objectionable had been present. And in every one of those theaters, the Australians had performed. When MacArthur made his feelings about the hats clear, Blamey's response was measured. "Those hats saved us in Greece." MacArthur was not persuaded. The private cables told the fuller story. While MacArthur was publicly describing Australian soldiers as tenacious, he was privately sending messages to Washington that told a different story. Undertrained, lacking in aggressive leadership, retreating when they should be holding. The same soldiers whose slouch hats he found undisciplined. The same soldiers who were, at the moment those cables were being sent, fighting on the Kokoda Track against a Japanese force that outnumbered them 5-1. Without adequate food, without adequate medicine, without adequate ammunition, and without their supreme commander anywhere near the jungle where the fighting was happening. MacArthur's headquarters was in Brisbane, the Lennon's Hotel, one of the finest hotels in Queensland. On the Kokoda Track in August 1942, Australian diggers in slouch hats were doing something that MacArthur's cables to Washington had suggested they weren't capable of. They were stopping Japan. Japanese intelligence captured during the campaign contained assessments of Australian fighting capability that should have given MacArthur pause. The Australians in their strange hats were described as ferocious, as unpredictable, as soldiers who used the terrain in ways that conventional military thinking hadn't prepared the Japanese for. The slouch hat wasn't a symbol of indiscipline. It was a piece of equipment designed for exactly this environment. Low brim for jungle camouflage, wide enough to protect against the rain that fell continuously on the Kokoda Track. Light enough to wear for weeks without the weight of a steel helmet adding to the physical burden of moving through mountain jungle. The Japanese who encountered Australian soldiers in those hats in the Owen Stanley Range did not find them amusing. They found them dangerous. In the aftermath of Milne Bay, the battle that handed Japan its first ever land defeat in the entire Pacific War, MacArthur issued a communiqué. He described the victory as the achievement of Australian and American forces. The Americans at Milne Bay had been engineers. They had built the aerodrome. They had not fought the battle. The battle had been fought by Australians. In slouch hats. The same hats MacArthur had called stupid. On the 6th of September 1942, MacArthur sent a cable to General Marshall in Washington. The Battle of Milne Bay had just ended. Australian soldiers had handed Japan its first ever land defeat in the entire Pacific War. And MacArthur's cable described the Australian forces as having demonstrated an inability to match the enemy in jungle fighting, with aggressive leadership lacking. That cable was sent on the same day that MacArthur was publicly praising Australian courage. In the same week that Australian soldiers were being described in captured Japanese intelligence as ferocious and unpredictable. The same men. Two completely different narratives. One for Washington, one for the press. The pattern had started before Milne Bay. In March 1942, before a single Australian soldier had fought under MacArthur's command, he was already cabling Washington with assessments of their limitations. Colonial troops without real fighting value. The phrase appeared in internal communications weeks before the Kokoda campaign had even started. MacArthur had made up his mind about the Australians before he had seen them fight. And when they fought, and won, he found ways to explain it that didn't require him to revise that assessment. On the Kokoda Track in July and August 1942, Australian soldiers were outnumbered 5-1. Militia boys of 18 and 19 with minimal training, inadequate equipment, and rations that weren't enough to sustain men doing what they were being asked to do. Facing the Japanese South Seas Force, 13,000 veterans who had never been stopped on land anywhere in the Pacific. MacArthur's cable to Washington during the critical weeks of the campaign described the Australians as retreating before inferior forces. Inferior forces. The same force that had swept through Malaya in 70 days. The same force that had taken Singapore. The same force that every Allied army in the Pacific had failed to stop. MacArthur called them inferior because the alternative was acknowledging that he had sent inadequate forces to defend a position that required more than he had provided. When the campaign turned, when the Japanese advance stalled and the Australians began pushing back, MacArthur's public communiques shifted. The success was presented as the result of strategic decisions made at headquarters. MacArthur's plan. Milne Bay was the clearest example of the double standard in action. The battle was fought entirely by Australian soldiers under Australian command. Major General Cyril Clowes, the 7th Brigade. Veterans of Tobruk alongside militia who had never seen combat before. 11 days. Japan's first land defeat of the war. MacArthur's public communique described the outcome as a hard blow to the enemy delivered by Australian and American forces. Australian and American. The Americans at Milne Bay were engineers. They had built the aerodrome. They had not fought the battle. And his private cable to Marshall, sent in the same period, described the Australian performance as not meeting the standard required for effective jungle operations. The same performance, the same battle. Two completely different assessments. One designed for public consumption, one designed to protect MacArthur's position in Washington. General Thomas Blamey understood exactly what was happening. In meetings with MacArthur that became increasingly tense through 1942, Blamey made the point directly. You send us without adequate resources, and then blame us for the consequences of fighting without them. MacArthur noted the complaint, and continued doing exactly what he had been doing. General Sidney Rowell, the Australian commander who had managed the Kokoda campaign on the ground, resigned under the pressure MacArthur's headquarters was applying. Australian officers circulated internal memos describing what they called the Yankee double standard, posing with victorious diggers for propaganda photographs, cabling Washington with assessments of their inadequacy, using their sacrifice to build a personal narrative of military genius. Curtin understood the dynamic, but Curtin also needed MacArthur. Australia needed American support more than it needed to publicly confront its supreme commander.
So the tension was managed. The cables stayed classified. The public narrative remained intact. The diggers had a name for him. Dugout Doug. The general who stayed in his hotel while they bled in the jungle. And when the war was over and MacArthur stood on the deck of the USS Missouri to accept Japan's surrender as the supreme symbol of Allied victory in the Pacific, the men who had stopped Japan on the Kokoda Track, at Milne Bay, at Sandakan, at Ambon, were watching from the sidelines, as they always had been. The slouch hat is still worn by the Australian Army today, not because tradition demands it, because it works. MacArthur saw a stupid hat. Japan saw something else. A soldier who was comfortable in the environment, who wore his hat the way he wore his identity, without apology, without adjustment for anyone's expectations, and who was, as a result, extraordinarily difficult to beat. There is one part of this story this documentary hasn't told yet. The men MacArthur called chocolate. The men whose hats he called stupid. What happened to them after the war? Not the battles, not the campaigns. What happened when they came home? To a country that didn't know how to process what they had seen. To a culture that said get on with it. To families that waited for them to talk about it. And waited. And waited. That story is the next one. If you want to see it, it's right up here.